As a watercolor artist or student, your choice of paper can have an enormous impact on the application of paint. But how can you determine which papers are best? In this video, we're going to visually examine the different watercolor paper options. And through our testing, you'll see how paper ingredients and differing levels of sizing influence the paper's ability to handle the paint. These variations are by brand, but even more so, they're by quality level. Our focus is on watercolor paper, as watercolor canvas, board, and UPO don't have as many variations in quality. In this video, I'll examine professional, student, and academy grade watercolor paper. Professional being the top and most expensive option, and academy being the least. For the professional paper, I'm using Arch's 140-pound cold-pressed paper. I personally prefer the thicker 300-pound version, but this will be fine for our purpose here. Top quality papers will specify that they're 100% cotton. This offers a naturally strong, absorbent, and archival paper fiber, and it runs about $2 per 9x12 sheet. For the student grade, I'm using Canson 140-pound cold-pressed paper, and I chose this because it's a common brand found in many craft stores. Notice that it does not mention cotton or even paper ingredients. This paper costs about 33 cents a sheet. And finally, my selection for the lowest quality of the three papers is Artist's Loft. This is also a 140-pound cold-pressed paper. Now it mentions being acid-free, but not the paper ingredients. Unless it says 100% cotton, you can assume that there's likely some form of filler, probably treated wood pulp, and that basically enables the manufacturer to lower the price, but it also lowers the quality. I'll refer to this paper throughout the video as Academy grade paper, and it costs about 27 cents a sheet. To make sure the test is fair, I'm using one professional grade paint, Winsor Newton Permanent Rose. And I'll use the same paint mix for every test. So let's get started. Here I've taped a piece of the professional, student, and academy grade papers to an acrylic board. Now I'll load my medium round brush and paint a direct line on each sheet, fully reloading for each stroke. There's not a huge difference at this point, other than the fact that the paint distribution is a little more consistent on the professional paper. Well, that was wet on dry. Now let's try wet and wet. I'll wet the surface and then repeat the direct line. This is how it looks on the professional paper. Now for the student paper, I can tell you right off the bat that the water is hardly absorbing, much less so than with the professional one. They must have a lot of sizing on here. Sizing is a kind of starch that helps slow absorption. The manufacturer may have overcompensated for the use of fillers, but it's too much, and as you can see, it causes flooding when I try to apply the stroke. Next is the Academy paper, using the same process. This one seems to be absorbing the water a little too quickly. When I apply the paint, it actually gives better results than the student version, but the spread stops pretty abruptly and the paint distributes a little oddly. But let's see how they look once they dry. The professional paper provided nice edges and smoother transitions than the other two. Here's the student paper. The pigment that sunk is very feathered, and then of course you have the floating particles which resulted from the flooding. The Academy has harder edges due to the quicker absorption. Now keep in mind, each paper says it's cold pressed, meaning it should have a slight surface texture. But notice how each version varies. Papers of every level will vary in texture and performance because of the differences in the milling process as well as the paper ingredients. Okay, now let's try blended strokes on each paper version. I'm using a two-stroke application method and lightening the load just a touch after each reload. We've seen that the student paper is oversized, and now we'll observe how that affects blended strokes. Now on this one you can tell the paint is sitting on the surface a little longer. It's especially important to lighten the load for this particular paper, because we've already learned that it doesn't absorb very quickly. And finally, the academic. The paint is absorbing more quickly and actually causing very slight seam lines between the strokes. Now let's use the same paint mix and paint a gradient on each one, beginning with the professional paper. It's important to make sure the paint load is equal to the painted area, so again I lighten my load a little bit. And now for the student paper. Even with a lighter load, you can see how much liquid from the prior wet area floods into the new stroke. On the Academy paper, we have too much absorption. As a result, the first swipe is hardly blending into the second row of liquid. Now, if we take the same paint and create a blend with one brush load and my round brush, as you see here, we get some nice results. Let's see how the paint equalizes as it sits. Here they are once they've dried. The three blends aren't too bad, but the gradients show a big difference, and that's due to their absorption rates. Notice how the difference in texture shows up in the bottom blends. Here's another wet and wet test. We're going to drop liquid watercolor into a wet area and watch how the paint responds. For each paper, I'll wet a circle and then drop in 2 drops of the paint, beginning with the professional paint. It's creating a nice rounded shape and it's fairly evenly distributed. Next, we'll try the student paper and the 2 drops. And you can see it's doing what it did with the wet and wet direct line. The water isn't really absorbing, it's really flooding. And now for the Academy paper. This initially looks similar to the professional paper, but then it suddenly absorbs, stopping pretty abruptly and creating some hard edges, as well as a strange pigment granulation, and it's not a granulating paint. So why the variation in response? Well, the student paper likely has a little too much sizing on the outside of the paper, causing the liquid to puddle until it can absorb. When it does absorb, the paper seems to swell excessively, implying too little internal sizing, thus the moat. With the Academy paper, we don't see as much of a swell, so it must have adequate internal sizing. But we're getting that strange pigment effect, and the paint didn't spread much. I suspect both a lack of sizing on the surface and perhaps a low quality size as well. As for the professional paper, it has a mild swell and an even spread in absorption. This tells you that it uses a well-balanced amount of sizing both internally and externally. Because again, remember that the only variant in these examples is the paper. It's the same paint and water amount. Let's look at the same examples once they've dried. Very different results from the same paint. Well, let's try the same test using granulating pigment, French ultramarine blue. First the professional, and then the student, and finally the academic. Here again, we can see the even spread on the professional paper, the uneven spread on the student paper, and the lack of spread and quick drop on the Academy paper. The last test we'll do is pouring on a slant. So I've placed a paper towel roll under one end of the acrylic board, and I've mixed up the 2 colors in Dixie cups. Now I'm using 1 full brush load of water to wet each piece of paper, one at a time. Once the water is evenly spread, I'll drop 2 drops of each paint at the top of the paper. Red is first. And notice how it instantly spreads out. while the blue, which has a heavier pigment, flows down the surface faster and more compacted. That's a great example of the difference in pigment weight, the red being lighter than the blue. Now we'll repeat the process with the student paper. 2 drops of red, and the pigment is really spreading. But more of it seems to stain right in, while the lighter pieces seem to float down the water. The blue drops quicker, like the professional paint, but it stays more confined. It seems to float along the surface a little bit more. And now for the Academy paper. It actually responded a lot like the student paper, the heavier particles absorbing right away, while the lighter particles floated a little farther. But notice how each of the boundaries has a hard edge. It's sunk right in. And the blue? It didn't make it nearly as far as the first two. In each, you have an area where the heavier particles settled into the paper, but the professional paper definitely encouraged a more even spread of the pink. More of the pigment basically made its way down the paper. Once the paint dried, the professional paper stayed fairly flat and had a more even spread of paint, meaning good internal and external sizing. The student paper warped more, so this again validates our theory that there is less internal sizing, but it must have had a decent amount of external sizing because the water stayed on the surface longer and the blue flowed faster. The Academy paper stayed fairly flat, so it must have decent internal sizing, but whatever external size they did add clearly got lifted when we added the water. Now, how do I know this? There's a ring of gloss around the wet area when it dried, and that's the sizing. So it washed off, basically. More evidence of a lack of sizing on the surface was the fact that the red paint had very hard feathered edges, and the blue heavy pigment had extreme granulation. Both paints didn't travel far as well. Now, the student paper we've been using is the Canson brand. It rang up at 33 cents per 9x12 sheet. Let's quickly see how a different student paper would perform. Are they all the same? The additional student paper that we'll examine is Strathmore 140-pound cold-pressed paper, and it runs about 87 cents a sheet, a little more than Canson. While we test the new student paper, I'm going to place the Canson test right next to it so we can compare. Note that the Strathmore paper has more texture. The directly painted stroke isn't much different. But let's see how the wet and wet behaves. Very similar to Canson. Interesting. It seems to have a lot of external sizing as well. Well, let's see how the blends and gradients go. The blend went on fairly smoothly. The paint seems to soak in a little better than the Canson paper. It seems to be creating a decent gradient, but you can see that it lifted pretty easily, which is another sign of increased sizing. Let me try it one more time, keeping it to 2 strokes. Better. There are still slight lines, but it performed much better than the Canson paper. That was another sample I had done with Canson. Now, here's the wet circle with 2 drops of paint. As it sits, it looks surprisingly similar to the Canson. I expected it to do better, actually. And finally, flow on a slanted surface. Again, it had a similar response. Look again at how similar the wet circle looks. Goodness. Now let's try another Academy paper. This time I'm going to use one of the cheapest watercolor papers I could find. This paper runs about 10 cents a sheet, as opposed to Artist's Loft paper that was about 27 cents a sheet. Again, I'll place the first Academy test paper next to the Aquarella paper. I can tell you that the Aquarella feels much thinner. The direct line went on rather unevenly, Let's see how it does wet and wet. Wow, the pigment dropped right away. It must have even less sizing than the artist's loft. Now here are the blended strokes. Better than I expected, but you can definitely see seam lines. The gradient is also absorbing very quickly and results in pretty obvious seam lines. And now the drops of paint in wet circles. You can see it spreads initially, but then absorbs and barely spreads. Compare that to the artist's loft. But let's see how it dries. You never know. Notice the difference in the wet and wet direct line. Look at the swelling of the paper. Clearly, this paper lacks internal sizing. And finally, we'll test the flow. It has about the same response as the artist's loft. Another thing to be aware of is that papers, at least the good papers, have a right and a wrong side to paint on. Usually, if you have a pad of paper, the way it's presented when you open the flap, that is the paintable side. Now, both sides are paintable, but sometimes the paint will not perform the same on the back side. Now, what if the paper is loose? Well, you can, number one, look for the side that has prominent texture. That's usually the preferred side. And if it's good paper, you may have an embossed symbol or brand listed. If you can read it, then that's the preferred side. Or if you hold the piece up to the light and you see a watermark, if you can read it, then that's the right side. If you can't read it, just flip the paper over. So let's get a closer look at the front and back side of a piece of watercolor paper. Here are two pieces of Arches watercolor paper. If we flip one sheet over, you can see a slight change in texture. That's due to the position of the paper when it runs through the milling process. Throughout this video, we've seen how professional paint performs on various grades of paper. But what happens if you use a lower grade of paint? In this section, we're going to quickly look at how each paint grade responds to its corresponding paper. So, Academy paint on Academy paper, student paint on student paper, and professional paint on professional paper. First, the professional paint on professional paper. We're doing blends that lead into a gradient. And now student on student. The coverage isn't bad, but it's definitely streakier and it lifts fairly easily. And finally, Academy on Academy. Boy, this one's very different. Not a good response at all. Now for wet and wet application. I'm using the dropper to drop in 2 drops of paint. It's spreading evenly, as expected. The student paint is not moving much, not like what we saw on the professional paper. And the academic is spreading even less. Here's a closer look. Here's the professional on professional and the student on student paper. Note the lack of absorption. And then the academic on academic paper, which hardly spread. And it has that strange granulation look again, except even worse. This whole exercise is a really good example of how quality in your supplies can impact the results. So what is some criteria you can use when selecting paper? First, you can go by price. Although it's not a guarantee, the higher the price, the more likely it is that it's better paper. Make sure you feel the paper. Is it pretty stiff? And does it have a nice weight to it? The thicker the paper, the less tendency to warp. It should also have a gently rough texture, unless you're looking for hot pressed paper. Now, if you want to make sure you get the best kind of paper, look for the words 100% cotton. And if you're able, hold the paper up to the light. If you see a watermark, or if there's an embossed symbol, you know it's a higher grade paper. Sometimes you can judge by wording. If you see words like student, collegiate, or academy, it's most likely mid to low grade paper. Generally, paying a little extra for a better quality paper is really worth it. So let's summarize what we've learned. To begin with, paper quality, what it's made of, and how it's processed can have a dramatic effect upon paint application and absorption. Not all papers are equal. The more your paper warps, the less internal sizing it may have. And we saw this throughout the instruction. The student paper often swelled excessively. We also saw what happens when a paper has too much or too little sizing on the surface. That really impacted absorption rates and flow, an issue we saw in all of the lesser paper qualities. So the take-home is, generally, the professional papers perform more reliably with more even distribution. Some student materials are passable, but they won't quite perform like the professional grade, and I would avoid academy grade altogether. The high-grade papers warp less, have more predictable rates of absorption, and are highly archival. So if you find yourself having a little difficulty achieving certain looks in watercolor, consider whether it could have something to do with your choice of paper. If you'd like to learn more about the materials used in watercolor painting, visit udemy.com and look up Foundations for Mastering Watercolor Painting. Or visit my YouTube channel.